Let me get started. Is this working? Are we goodish? Great. Well, welcome everyone, and by that I mean everyone here. It's so fabulous to see such a great turnout for the first of our Colloquium series. My name is Nikhil Anand, and I'm delighted to be co-organizing this year's series with Professor Kathleen D. Morrison on natures. In developing a theme... Louder? Okay. Yeah, move it on. Is that better? Still not good?
There it is.
Okay, I'll try not to enunciate as much. In developing a theme for this year's events, Kathy and I have been talking about the different ways to interpret the world and make sense of humanity as they reverberate all around us. Natures, forceful, anthropogenic, and yet beyond our control. Take the hurricanes that ran through Houston and Florida these past few weeks, where news stories tried to parse out how much of these events were nature and how much were anthropogenic climate change. What has been clear is that nature can no longer be seen as stable and as locatable as it ever was in times past. This colloquium asks after the enduring transformations of natures, human and non-human. What is the work that nature continues to do in fields as diverse as biology, linguistics, history, and the material sciences? How do new and emergent natures challenge the very definition of academic disciplines, including the work of anthropology and anthropologists? And how are we as a discipline able to make a difference in this changing world? Now, the calendar for our fall semester is more or less finalized. And in making this list, we wanted to be especially attendant to the ways in which scholars have been drawing on diverse methodologies and diverse approaches with which to apprehend nature. We have a large and exciting number of younger scholars on the calendar, and we also have a good number of our faculty from the Department of Anthropology. And on that note, I'm very grateful that Kathy Morrison was able to be persuaded to kick off our series today. And I think it couldn't actually be a better opening for our colloquium, and that's very evident in what we see. Professor Morrison is the Sally and Alvin Shoemaker Chair of Anthropology. Her research focuses on the historical ecologies of South Asia. Based in the landscapes and waterscapes of southern India, she's currently working on several projects within and beyond South Asia to examine the historic and ongoing relationships between people, their environments, and their political institutions. What, she asks, might the traces of infrastructures built between the 10th and the 16th centuries in southern India for irrigation, trade, food, and forests tell us not only about past histories of human-environment relationships, but also the means and modes for living in the future? To answer these questions, Professor Morrison conducts research using an impressive range of techniques and methods, putting pollen analysis and the semiotics of temple inscriptions in conversation with the literature on big data and post-colonial theory. As one of the few who focus on the ecologies and political ecology, she demonstrates how nature is not just a fecund, but also a rather provincial concept, one whose histories conceal many other stories of how people live and have lived in this world. Professor Morrison's talk today is entitled The Anthropocene and Other Stories, South Asia and the Planet. Please join me in welcoming Professor Morrison.
Thank you, Nikhil. That's beautiful. I wish I could get you to give my talk, which is somewhere. Oh, here it is. So it turns out, those of us who teach know that when you ask students to do presentations, no student wants to be the first one to give the presentation. And it turns out that faculty are exactly the same as students. And so somehow, because we're organizing the symposium, one of us was going to be the one to go first. And I guess I drew the short straw. But I'm very happy to be here. And putting this talk together recently, I want to make sure I don't push the keyboard down accidentally. A few years ago, I published an essay, kind of a short essay, about how certain entrenched narratives of changes in humans and the environment, have structured our understanding of environmental history in India specifically. And I thought this would make this essay slightly enlarged, would make a nice little book, like a very, very little book. But in starting on that little book, life intervened in certain kinds of ways. One was I started a new project, Land Cover 6K, about which I'll talk a little bit today. And I moved halfway across the country to the University of Pennsylvania. And because of that, I'd say that this book is still kind of half written. So it's been languishing for a couple of years, more than I would care to say. But while this book manuscript sort of festered in my conscience, another environmental narrative, one that wasn't really so prominent when I started the book, has really gathered force, engulfing all others. And of course, this is the narrative of the Anthropocene. And unlike chapter 2, which I now have to rewrite in the book, there's really no need, I think, for me to explain to you what the Anthropocene is. We all know that at this point. And in fact, I'd say there's really something of an Anthropocene industry. And I would say that the objections that I and very few others probably have about the term already feels to me both kind of quaint and futile. I mean, I don't like the term very much, but it seems silly to be saying so still, right? But nevertheless, as someone who works on long-term change, and particularly on the entangled, inseparable relationships between humans and the non-human world, I think there's something still very troubling about the idea. So I want to argue today that the Anthropocene concept, for all its intended value of highlighting the significance of the current crisis, is also really deeply problematic. So let me be clear at the outset, though, that I am not disputing the magnitude or the significance of current levels of anthropogenic impact on the Earth system. This is obviously beyond doubt. Rather, my concern is with the attempt to define a new kind of temporality, right? A debate that has shifted concern away from issues of process, and by tracing a well-worn path down pre-existing narratives of change, really risks undermining its own overt political aim of creating awareness and concern in the present crisis. So the Anthropocene concept is, at one level, an argument about human history and about human nature, right? It's an effort to temporally fix distinct modalities of human-environment relations. And the novelty, or apparent novelty, of combining disparate agentive forces, human and the non-human, which I would say has really dazzled both humanists and physical scientists. This, of course, has long been a primary area of interest for scholars in archaeology and political ecology, among others. So before rushing into pronouncements about the nature of human impact, then, it's worth thinking a little bit about how these areas of work may be able to help us understand some of the processes and patterns of change. So in this talk, I situate the Anthropocene narrative within a consideration of the power of stories more generally, and the role of both the sciences and the humanities in evaluating these. So to propose a new modality of human environmental agency, of course, is to tell a story of change. Like other narratives of decline, this one has a starting point, it has a crisis, and it has a downward slide. Defining the Anthropocene as a period, as a time period, rather than as a process, then requires, like all kinds of chronology building, certain kinds of ontological decisions, right? What divides the then from the now? How do we know that these are really different? Not only Anthropocene talk, but as we'll see, other kinds of environmental narratives make these same kinds of judgments. So in environmental science, environmental history, archaeology, restoration ecology, and public policy and environmental activism, we can identify a series of stock narratives, stories which are built on foundational assumptions about nature, culture, and change. These stock narratives are surprisingly mobile and tenacious. They appear not only in policies and in popular culture, but also in things like scientific papers. So my talk, as I said, is drawn from this perhaps never to be finished book, but it's a project that uses multiple kinds of historical archives, here we are, texts, archaeology, and paleoenvironmental data to evaluate the veracity and the import of these environmental narratives, particularly in the context of South Asia. So I want to make two simple points today. First, that, narratives have power, even in science. And this is not at all, obviously, a controversial point, but within archaeology and environmental science of my own field, I think we've really not paid sufficient attention to this. But narratives are not, however, determinative. We can think critically about how we constitute observations as evidence and how we deploy those observations in the ways that speak back to taken for granted intellectual frameworks. That is, we can't avoid telling stories, but we can certainly evaluate the narratives that we read and those that we also make. So my talk today is meant in a way to bridge the doing of science with the analysis of intellectual frameworks within which scientific evidence is deployed. So there's no simple way, of course, to step outside of our own frameworks. And as I hope to illustrate today, the idea that we can, for example, evaluate narratives of environmental history with evidence of environmental science really ignores the theory-ladenness of all forms of evidence, no matter where they're from. But still, I think that we can and we should take seriously the potential non-human material worlds to resist our cultural constructions, and in so doing, I think, help us to expose our ignorance. So let's briefly turn to narrative. Environmental narratives tend to build on a shared set of foundational assumptions, which are included, but not limited to, of course, the separation of nature and culture, the idea of a balance of nature or of a natural equilibrium, assumptions about human nature, and a quest for temporal baselines. In South Asia, as elsewhere, baseline thinking often uses the pre-colonial as a kind of mostly imagined, really, an entirely homogenized starting point for the beginnings of what are often seen to be real environmental change. And this, of course, this idea of a kind of homogenized past period of a environmental baseline is very reminiscent of recent discussions about the Anthropocene. So today, let's just look very simply at two basic storylines: upward-oriented stories about progress and improvement, and downward-oriented stories of decline and decay. So first, progressivist schemes. Progressivist schemes are not very fashionable as master narratives these days, but as we'll see, they really still play a role in environmental narratives. And here we tend to find certain kinds of peoples or of ideas that are associated with upward movement, whether modern, Western, scientific people and ideas, for example, and others who are not, pre-modern, non-Western, traditional, perhaps, right? In the context of South Asia, these classic example of progressivist schemes derive from colonial science. Colonial scholars and administrators, often the same people, saw colonized people as situated in a progression of agricultural and ecological sophistication, from primitive swidden or slash and burn agriculturalists to more advanced plow cultivators who nevertheless still lack modern scientific understanding of cultivation practices or of forest management. Swidden, for example, was often seen by colonial officials in South Asia and elsewhere, not only as primitive and then hence also necessarily ancient, but also as irrational and destructive, posing a threat to forest environments through the use of fire and the clearing of what were seen to be pristine forests. Incidentally, despite a huge amount of careful research in anthropology, geography, and other fields, documenting the agroecological sophistication of shifting cultivation, this perspective is, in fact, one that we still see repeated in conservation circles. So for colonial officials, then, the perceived destruction and disorder of indigenous farming demanded the imposition of scientific, disciplined knowledge. Within the British Empire, this progressive and civilizational narrative was indexed especially by the notion of improvement. One key area of improvement was the development of what came to be called scientific forestry, with its logic of management, of rationality, of profit, and of planning. 19th century scientific forestry focused on imagining forests for timber production, and built the foundation of what turns out to be an ongoing legacy of displacement and dispossession of rural people in the name now of conservation. So it's critically important to realize that even when foresters had exemplary motives, they tended to assume a priori that certain kinds of people, traditional, backward, irrational people, perhaps necessarily had specific kinds of relationships with the natural environment, destructive, wasteful. This is all very familiar to you, but it's going to reemerge in the end of my talk when we start to talk about the science of the Anthropocene. Oops. I gave away my secret. Okay, so there's no question that current ideas, let's go talk about declensionist accounts then. There's no question that current ideas about humans and the environment are dominated now by what historians like to call declensionist accounts. Accounts of loss, of degradation, and really of doom, right? In India, some nationalist scholars inverted British colonial perspectives, there we go, okay? Shifting the signs of value in colonial accounts of backward farmers in need of Western intervention to construct instead histories and ecologies of a kind of golden age in which traditional arrangements were seen to exemplify an ecosystem-like state of balance, harmony, and stability. Ghats and Guha, for example, in their influential syntheses of Indian environmental history, paint a very rosy picture of pre-colonial traditional balance. At the most extreme, their perspective sees caste as being analogous to ecological niche, suggesting that pre-colonial India formed a kind of textbook, Udamesque ecosystem that was stable, that was sustaining to its members, and in equilibrium. Ghats and Guha argued that traditional harmony with nature was interrupted by colonial intervention, which brought deforestation, degradation, and a breakdown of traditional forms of ecological management, which were themselves assumed to be, and are still often assumed to be, communal, harmonious, and equitable. So as I've discussed in print elsewhere, so I don't want to belabor this point, depicting these pre-colonial worlds as unchanging and equilibrial certainly deprives both humans and the natural world of their dynamic histories, really inverting colonial discourses without subjecting them to any kind of serious empirical challenge. Ecological romanticism relies fundamentally on these declensionist accounts, maybe because there's not really much action before the fall, if we're thinking about it in terms of a story. This kind of perspective doesn't seem to encourage study of the actual past, the boring past, perhaps. Good stories, of course, need a crisis, and it's the crisis itself, the loss of the forest, the loss of tradition, of innocence, that's really central to this literature. So declensionist accounts of environmental change in South Asia tend to dwell on the precise timing of the turning point, or the presumed turning point, rather like debates today of the Anthropocene. When exactly can we mark the beginning? So both progressivist and declensionist narratives then struggle with a problem of beginnings. What was the original, the natural state of the South Asian vegetation, for example? And of course, there's no such thing. Right? The subcontinent was a human-occupied landscape long before the end of the Pleistocene, so that in a real sense, there is no human-free analog for paleoecology. There's no originary period against which to measure later transformation. So both progressivist and declensionist accounts are then variants of the same basic theory of socialized nature. From an original state of nature, we might call it, human action is added. And this leads either to equilibrium, sort of harmony with nature, followed by disequilibrium on the romantic side of things, or its reverse on the colonial. But all agree, first of all, that equilibrium is possible, and second, that the original condition of nature has been modified unnaturally by human beings. So if colonial degradation visions, to borrow a term from Fairhead and Leach, paint a picture of primitivity and ignorance leading to ecological destruction, which is then checked only by the application of science and good management, then romantic visions simply replace this transition into the colonial and post-colonial periods. So progressivist and declensionist narratives are thus really more alike than they are different. They're mirror images that are assembled from a common stock of assumptions, allowing for various kinds of interstitial moments of stability or harmony. These narrative modalities come together today in development discourses, both technocratic and activist, as we'll see. So much development thinking, for example, partakes of both declensionist and progressivist narratives, suggesting, for example, that indigenous peoples once lived in harmony with nature until the forces of Western civilization or modernity, colonialism, capitalism, destroyed both nature and culture. This sorry state of affairs requires Western science to redirect the story into a narrative of progress. So in these stories then, the temporal location of loss, the moment when harmony was disrupted and ontologically new forms of people or practice emerged, tend to be contested, or really often the most contested part of the story. And again, an interesting parallel to discourse around the Anthropocene. Okay, so this is all a little abstract. So let's look at one pervasive narrative about the history of India's environment, the declensionist myth, what I call the myth of the primeval forest. In this Sylvan tale, most or all of India was once covered in forests, a condition that's consistently degraded through time, but with particular moments of loss that are associated with modernity, with colonialism, or sometimes even, as we'll see, with the introduction of Islam. Outside of India, too, of course, there's a widespread assumption that the trajectory of landscape change has been from forest to open areas, with forests always in decline relative to the growth of human population. This assumption is explicitly built into anthropogenic land cover change models, as we'll see by the end of the talk. And even without any paleoenvironmental data, many scholars have assumed that clearing of primeval forests was always at issue sometime in the past, and that originally the subcontinent was entirely cloaked in forests. So I've written quite a bit about how environmental historians make this assumption, and how archaeological and paleobotanical data can be used to evaluate it. But certainly it's important to note that environmental science is itself not immune to the lure of stories. So in classical or Clementsian ecology, the notion of a climax vegetation, you don't actually have to read that little quote, I just couldn't resist it, is related to ideas of plant succession, especially primary succession taking place under natural or non-human conditions. Like models of cultural evolution, succession studies substitute space for time. That is, although vegetation succession explicitly refers to a diachronic process, it often is reconstructed on the basis of observation of an extant series of plant communities, rather than by using paleoecological data. Does that make sense? So the first study of succession was done by University of Chicago ecologist Henry Chandler Coles in the Indiana Dunes area by looking at the changes in plants as he walked away from Lake Michigan. And he posited succession as a process of change. But of course, it wasn't an observation of a process of change, it was an observation of a process of spatial variation. Okay. All right, so then, okay, I already just said that. So historical evidence then is subverted to what we might call a kind of imaginative history. So concepts of vegetation succession, and especially a vegetation climax, then suggest a beginning and an end, the latter governed by a stable, albeit dynamic equilibrium. Right? The vegetation climax then constitutes the mythical origin point for both progressivist and declensionist discourses. It is the state of nature that humans will eventually despoil, a separation of humans from the natural world that is itself, you might say, profoundly non-ecological. Clementsian ecology, of course, is hardly the state of art in ecology, and I'm not trying to say that it is, certainly, but still pervasive frameworks calling for the construction of human-free nature as an analytical baseline can lead to some very curious results. Paired with the common assumption that human impacts are progressive, linear, and accelerating, the result are narratives that can, for example, completely reverse chronology in an effort to make nature prior to culture. These unexamined assumptions don't necessarily structure scientific procedures themselves, but they do work to align interpretation. So let's look at an example from an actual published study. Okay, so for example, in their study of the impact of cardamom cultivation on montane forest ecosystems in Sri Lanka, here's a nice cardamom plantation, Duckall and his colleagues carefully sampled, identified, and analyzed vegetation assemblages from plots in the Knuckles Forest Reserve, where cultivation has been banned since 1985. At first glance, this analysis seems straightforward. Areas of cardamom plantation are compared to areas of natural forest in terms of stem density, stand basal area, canopy openness, and soil nutrients. Perfectly straightforward. A closer look at this specific forest reveals a problem, however. As Dahl et al. Note, all of the forest has been potentially subject to agriculture in the past. Although official records note that some 3,000 hectare of the 17+ thousand hectare reserve was formerly under cardamom cultivation, this is known to be a vast underestimation. Indeed, as they write, quote, "We observe very little natural forest without planted cardamom during 3 years of fieldwork," explaining that some areas have been under cultivation for more than a century. This observation is borne out by the presence of cardamom plants in all of their study plots. So in order to create a baseline, the older agroforestry plots, however, are simply recast as natural forest. Their human history is erased, while more recently abandoned agroforestry plots stand in for degraded culture or cardamom plantations. The long-term complex history of planting, fallowing, replanting, and abandoning specific locations is thus recast as an older nature and a younger culture, the former pristine and the latter degraded, really almost by definition. So this construction of a nature-culture duality out of a mosaic of what we might call socio-natural spaces creates a curiously inverted chronology. Dahl et al. Write, quote, "The densities of seedlings, saplings, and small trees in cardamom plantations have not recovered from pre-disturbance values during the 25 years since active management ceased." But the so-called natural forest here is not really pre-disturbance at all. If anything, if you want to think successionally, it's post-disturbance. It's further along or later in a successional pathway and not earlier. But wanting to see nature as a kind of analytical category, it was first constructed by carving away the human contribution to the socio-natural landscape and then set up as necessarily prior to human disturbance. But the temporality is really inverted here. The plots they imagine to represent nature or natural forest are really successionally later than the plots imagined to represent culture. And this inversion is consequential, right? It leads the authors to overlook the fact that they know the answer to how long what they call recovery may take. So they write rather wistfully, quote, "The existence of pervasive impacts of cardamom cultivation so long after active management ceased suggests that recovery to pre-disturbance conditions will take a long time, a very long time." Quote, "All right, so in fact, if they're right about the history of cultivation, and I'm sure they are, it's a very good and careful study, right? They know precisely how long this process is going to take. If the oldest cardamom plantings are really around 100 years old, but most beginning in the 1960s, then it will take somewhere between 50 and 110 years for the so-called degraded plots to look like the natural plots." So this is clear when we reimagine the pre-disturbance natural forest as fields left fallow for longer and not as untrammeled nature. So stories of forests lost and regained, now they picked on some environmental scientists, are not, of course, limited to scholars. They also underpin environmental activism. So consider, for example, an account presented by the Energy and Resources Institute's website for children, EduGreen, on the history of forests in India. And they're very tiny. I put this up for me to read, really, not for you, okay? So here's what they write in this website for children's education in India. "There's enough evidence to show that dense forest once covered India. The changing forest composition and cover can be closely linked to the growth and change of civilizations. Over the years, as man progressed, the forest began gradually depleting. The growing population and man's dependence on the forest have been mainly responsible for this. All ancient texts have some mention of the forest and the activities that were performed in these areas. Forests were revered by the people, and a large number of religious ceremonies centered on trees and plants. Sacred groves were marked around the temples where certain rules and regulations applied. When Chandragupta Maurya came to power, he realized the importance of the forests and appointed a high officer to look after the forests. Ashoka stated that wild animals and forests should be preserved and protected. He launched programs to plant trees on a large scale. During the Muslim invasions, a large number of people had to flee from the attacks and take refuge in the forest. This was a beginning of phase of migration to the forest. They cleared vast areas of forest to make way for settlement. During the early part of the British rule, trees were felled without any thought. The history of modern Indian forestry was a process by which the British gradually appropriated forest resources for revenue generation But then after some time, the British began to regulate and conserve. Okay, there's so many more issues in this text than we can really discuss here. But the narrative structure, I hope, is at least clear. Both forest loss and pre-colonial balance somehow oddly coexist, although what we might call appropriately indigenous rulers, like the rulers of the Mauryan Empire, have somewhat impeccable conservation credentials. Muslim invaders upset the balance, a loss which is further accelerated under British colonialism. Science and management, though, colonial forestry, again scientific forestry, intervene, however, in a developmentalist mode, providing hope for the future. So it's easy and it's fun, I think, to look for these storylines in history, in science, and in activism, and to think about the work that they do as narratives, but clearly I think this is not enough. We also have a responsibility to go beyond the meta, let us say, and to evaluate these. So do the empirical bases of these narratives matter? Of course they do. Basic standards of veracity aside, which I don't think we should put aside, but there's always multiple interests at stake in any environmental narrative, right? So protecting our own interests in conservation and in rural livelihoods, I'm going to say that's my interest, certainly requires credibility. So the ecologist and historian Vasant Sabharwal, for example, has documented predictions of the imminent destruction that deforestation poses to the Himalayan slopes. Predictions that are written in more or less the same terms, in the same locations, in texts dating hundreds of years apart. So this kind of infinitely receding horizon of disaster must eventually, I think, reduce the credibility of such accounts. And I think we do better to situate contemporary action on real historical footings rather than on assumed progressions or regressions of change. So the power of deforestation narratives derives, I think, in part from the hold that declensionist narratives have in general, but also, I think, from a kind of fuzziness about prior conditions. The vast tree-covered landscapes of the infinite and indefinite and, say, infinitely receding horizon of South Asia looming large. So, of course, there's no doubt that deforestation has been significant in the past, and I'll say that again, and continues to be a challenge. In India, several of the most persistent accounts of forest loss, as we'll see, can be found in locations where, as it turns out, there either never were any extensive forests, or where forest expansion may actually be quite recent, which really inverts the dominant narrative. So let's take a quick look at two of those places. First, we'll start on the Gangetic Plain. So the floodplain of the river Ganges in northern India is one of the most fertile and densely settled parts of India today. The floodplain itself is really a kind of work in progress, formed only during the late Quaternary, its contours shaped by meandering rivers. If any part of India seems fully cultural, this really has to be it. Right? But even here, forests loom large in the imagination. For many years, archaeologists suggested that agriculture could only have been possible on the densely forested Gangetic Plain after the development of iron tools made possible the plowing of the heavy soils and clearing the densely forested, dense forests. So we have heavy soils and dense forests on the Gangetic Plain. But the first blow to this heroic account of forests felled by iron axes came from the recognition that elsewhere, ancient peoples handily cut forests with stone tools. So the postulated resistance of the Gangetic forest to farming also began to seem less and less likely as archaeologists began to look for pre-Iron Age settlements and found them. So clearly then, farmers with stone tools did settle on the fertile, hydrologically active northern floodplains, and while talk of heavy soils sort of declined in the archaeological literature, forest clearing was still always presumed to be an issue. Gangetic forests also show up in scholarship in later time periods too. Environmental historians of the early modern period in particular, discussing the 17th and 18th centuries, have also imagined extensive forests on the Gangetic Plain, drawing a sharp contrast between the current open landscape and colonial era, they presume colonial era forest loss. So forests then play both a role in both the progressivist narratives of a dense wood conquered by humans through technological ingenuity in archaeology, and a declensionist narrative of colonial rupture and loss in environmental history, all the same area. But recent paleoecological studies, and I'm not going to go through them, if you love this sort of thing as I do, we can talk about it later, definitively show that many parts of the Gangetic Plain, here's the takeaway, were never densely forested at all, with pollen data showing open vegetation dominating throughout the Holocene. So this is Sharma et al. Study. You can see there's very few trees. You have radioisotope data, or stable isotope data consistent with grasslands. Similarly, Chawan's work shows the same kind of thing. Right? Certainly much more research is needed here, but the claim of unbroken forest cover across the Gangetic Plain really has to be put to rest. The different stories of Gangetic history then showing how the forest was conquered or how late forest loss was are built on this foundational myth of the Gangetic forest rather than on any actual empirical evidence for these. Okay, let's go from the north to the south now. Unlike the Gangetic Plain in North India, the Western Ghats in southern India have considerable forest cover today. Often represented as remote and exotic, the Ghat uplands have been opaque to mainstream history in a way that's allowed upland people to be represented both as ahistorical, apart from the mainstreams of history, and also as agentive threats to contemporary biodiversity. So for the last several thousand years, though, Ghat forests featured prominently in international trade, with spices such as black pepper of major economic importance. Many upland peoples, who were later to be represented by anthropologists as untouched primitives, grew or gathered forest products for this international trade. Thus, even these verdant green slopes of the Ghats cannot be seen in any way as culture-free. At the very highest elevations within the mountains, are we supposed to be there yet? Maybe. Okay. So at the very highest elevations within the mountains, discourses of natural forests and what are seen as human remnants give way to straightforward declensionist narratives of culturally affected forests and forest remnants. So let's go right up to the top of the Western Ghats. We're actually quite cold in these high elevation areas. So as we've seen, scientists can be just as prone as others to structure narratives using imagined past. When colonial accounts of landscape change in the high elevation Nilgiri Hills, while colonial accounts, blamed local groups for woodland loss, you can see these little patchy bits of forest here. Ecologists too have represented the patchwork of forests and grasslands in the Nilgiri Hills as products of loss. Right? Open grasslands, these open grasslands you can see in the top photo here, are sometimes argued to be degraded shola forests, newer culturalized places formed as products of degraded natural forests. Grasslands, it's been argued, are recent human creations caused by grazing, burning, and cultivation. So just like on the Gangetic Plain, though, in a way, oddly, paleoenvironmental studies show that this is almost exactly the reverse of the actual progression of vegetation change in the Nilgiris. Kanner et al., among many others, just one study, show that grassland formations have characterized much of the vegetation above 1,500 meters since the late Pleistocene. Indeed, several studies of pollen, soil, and stable isotopes show that some of the Nilgiri shola forests, those little patches of forest you saw, are of quite recent age, formed within the last 1 to 200 years. This particular one, I put a little red circle around isotope values that represent forested vegetation. You can see they're up near the top of this 3,000-year sequence. Okay. So most sampling locations record upland grasslands in the Nilgiris in the early Holocene, open formations that were either slowly afforested starting around 4,000 years ago, or in other cases more quickly transitioned from grassland to forest during the last several hundred years, like you see in this diagram. So in these high elevation areas then, I'm supposed to be here? Yeah, okay. Paleoenvironmental data pose significant challenges to the ahistorical accounts of Nilgiri ecology, which has led biologists to conclude that the patchiness of the shola forests we see in these high elevations is not, in fact, a consequence of recent forest degradation. And this, I think, is a nice example of the incompleteness of the hold that stories have over evidence, or let us say, of our power to tell alternative stories, right? But even in these newer accounts, which see the patchy grassland shola mosaic of the Nilgiris and other high elevations as natural, even in these new accounts, humans are only ever mentioned as agents of forest destruction. Right? Evidence for very recent forest expansion is, in these studies by ecologists, never attributed to human action, but instead always to climate change. So while there's still a lot of work to be done on this, it might be expected that over the centuries, agriculturalists, foragers, and others have modified vegetation in this biodiversity hotspot in ways which are now misrecognized as being natural. The patchy, high elevation forests of the Nilgiris are likely to have changed in response both to climate and to human activity, the latter involving woodland expansion as well as retreat. And there's no convincing climatic account of this in any case. All right, so let me conclude these stories of phantom forests in India by pointing out that, of course, people have deforested landscapes of South Asia. So in my study area in northern Karnataka, kind of in the middle of the peninsula, for example, archaeological and remote sensing evidence show us that human land use in the Neolithic and Iron Age led to both significant erosion off of granitic inselbergs, or island mountains, like you can see in this picture, as well as to the development of deep hillside terraces and colluvial deposition in the valleys below. So a lot of dirt came down off the hill. So there's lots of deforestation, lots of movement of soil. Okay, in the later middle or medieval period, again, loss of woody cover, deforestation if you like, was associated with significant episodes of erosion which damaged irrigation infrastructure and endangered rural livelihoods. So our pollen work, still going on, from samples atop the Karibakale Inselberg, here we are taking samples, shows that pollen from certain woody climbers or woody plants disappeared during the middle period, never to regenerate. So this complex history then has no pre-human baseline and no simple trajectory. These same granitic hills that were a focus of settlement for almost 2,000 years, from the beginning of agriculture to the period of early cities, and have been subjected to grazing, burning, and plant collecting and other collecting for more than 5,000 years, are now recognized as mini biodiversity hotspots, home to light and heat-loving plants and animals, including all kinds of endemic lichens and turtles and things. Okay, so I'm going to skip this under hills then. Okay, so our work shows then, here we go. Okay, so our work shows then that there's no single way of being human in the Earth system, and no kind of person, traditional, modern, Western, indigenous, uniquely destructive or uniquely conserving of the environment. It's not about who we are, it's about how we act. Oh, I shouldn't have skipped this because it's so awesome. Okay, so I was talking about up and down, deforestation, afforestation, but the idea that there may be tipping points, if you want to be trendy, or moments of no return when we can't go back to the way things are, I think is possible when you look at the large-scale legal and extra-legal mining in the Asandra Hills, particularly ahead of the Beijing Olympics, which has blasted away the top of the mountaintop in a way to suggest that woody vegetation is not going to recover for a very long time. Okay. So given the pervasive appeal of simplistic environmental narratives, then, it's worth thinking carefully about the work that the notion of the Anthropocene does as a declensionist narrative, one which has a kind of family resemblance to the primitive modern dichotomy that we saw in both colonial and nationalist histories in India. Here too, in Anthropocene discourse, there can be a kind of progressivist twist. The argument that science and technology, progress, will now save us, despite perhaps also causing the problem in the first place. So as I've recently argued then, the search for geologically visible markers of the human, of the golden spikes amenable to stratigraphic specification of an Anthropocene, have come to overshadow work on the actual processes of anthropogenic change. As several scholars have noted, the Anthropocene concept constructs a unitary narrative, a narrative about humans as a species, effectively naturalizing the specific cultural behaviors, accumulation, inequality, colonialism, capitalism, and more that are arguably responsible for elevated CO2 levels. Not all humans were or are equally responsible for climate and changing effects, and yet the sense of both species-level causation and, much more convincingly, species-level risks unhelpfully displaces analysis both from empirical patterns of change and, I think, from potential mitigation strategies. So despite its focus on species-scale activity, the unitary global narrative of the Anthropocene has the perhaps unintended effect of creating one or more moments of ontological change within the history of Homo sapiens. If it was farming that led to our downfall, for example, the Ruddiman early Anthropocene hypothesis, then foragers emerge as a different kind and perhaps a more virtuous kind of human than those forest-killing farmers. These other kinds of humans are, if somehow better than us, though, also curiously lacking in a kind of agency that we have, an historical separation that's disturbingly similar to older narratives of progressive movement towards civilization. So as I've argued for the specific histories of South Asia, on a global scale too, we need to subject accounts of historical patterns of human land use and their impact on vegetation, carbon cycling, and other factors of significance for climate change to empirical analysis. And this is indeed the focus of this ongoing project, which has destroyed the writing of my book, Land Cover 6K. Land Cover 6K is a multidisciplinary working group that's designed to evaluate the human impact on the Earth system over the last 10,000 years. We aim to collate and commensurate historical, archaeological, and paleoenvironmental evidence of both human land use and also land cover or vegetation. So while we're just getting started, after 3 years, we feel like we're just getting started, it's clear that the complex and variable forms of human impact on the Earth system that we see in South Asia are by no means unique, right? This isn't, of course, surprising, but by being able to quantify and analyze this variability in a more robust way, I hope we may end up unsettling some of the unitary narratives that really animate the present moment. So while empirical sufficiency is critically important, and that's why we're taking all this time to put this data together, both the work that the Anthropocene concept is intended to do and the form it takes are also quite important. I've argued that the Anthropocene is unnecessary, I hope you got that, not because humans have not changed the Earth, but because we've done so throughout the Holocene and even before. Indeed, as Lewis and Maslin, whose nature cover I put up at the beginning, note, the Holocene itself was originally designed to be an explicitly human period. So the Holocene really is the Anthropocene. To a surprising extent, though, the Anthropocene industry operates by expanding Western European historical experiences. This is a nice little Swedish farm. Swedish farms are nice, but they're not everything. Okay, so existing models of anthropogenic land cover change, or what we call ALCC, because it's too hard to say that, for example, tend to build out from Europe and from the temperate zones, taking all other regions as variants on this unmarked category. Building out from European history has given Anthropocene discourse a particular kind of flavor, not only within the scientific community, but also among those who have embraced the concept with the fervor of the converted. Chiefly humanists, for whom the idea of global anthropogenic agency is particularly new, and I would say many hard scientists who have finally managed to naturalize human social relations into determinative models. So most proposals for an Anthropocene era adopt a rather limited historical perspective, assuming that significant environmental change began only with the European, and especially the British Industrial Revolution. This can become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, with several early influential papers considering evidence on land transformation by humans only for about the last 300 years. And then guess what? They found out that the last 300 years were the most important. So while the significance of recent change is absolutely beyond doubt, and I can't say that often enough, what's less clear is how novel such change really is. So by shutting out the consideration of longer-term change, we foreclose the possibility that anthropogenic change has a longer, has a more complex, or more variable trajectory than is generally assumed. And elsewhere, as I shamelessly promote on this slide, I've discussed the need to provincialize the Anthropocene concept, drawing on Dipesh Chakrabarty's argument against expanding Eurocentric frameworks of history to other parts of the world. I won't repeat that entire argument here, except to point out that the narratives of environmental change that we've already discussed in the context of India, and specifically the declensionist myth of the pre-primeval forest, also appear deep within the science of the Anthropocene in climate models. And that's what I want to talk about now, to close with. So atmospheric circulation, ocean circulation, and land surface relationships are all important parts of climate models. Land surface relationships, as most of you may know, include vegetation as one factor affecting heat, moisture, and albedo, among other things. Vegetation, or say land cover, thus plays a role in climate, okay, simply put. Current models, though, suffer from an inability to model anthropogenic land cover change, instead relying on simulations of climate-induced vegetation, what they call potential natural vegetation, okay, potential natural vegetation. We know, however, that humans have long modified the vegetation, that's not too controversial, and that past potential natural vegetation is not always the same as actual past vegetation. You can see why I use acronyms. One way this deficit has been addressed is through modeling. So what are the usually called Alsisi models then? Posit relationships between historic population levels and human-induced land cover change. So population almost directly to vegetation. It's a complicated story we can talk about. Models of past anthropogenic land cover change differ significantly, as you can see in this comparison of 4 different models for the same time period, around AD 800 or so, like the AD, because I'm an archaeologist. So these are 2 models by Jed Kaplan's team and 2 other models, including the Hyde 3.1 model. You can see that their idea, and I'm sorry I left out the caption, is the dark green is percent of vegetation cover under natural vegetation, and the lighter colors are relative levels of human transformation of natural vegetation. Okay, so rather than trying to deal with actual data from paleoenvironmental studies or from archaeology, ALCC models build on assumptions about a basic sets of relationships between population levels and their impact on vegetation. So the KK10 model, for example, you can see in the top 2 different versions of it, of Jed Kaplan, was initially based on a simulation of change for European vegetation over the last 3,000 years, taking Western Europe as a baseline for population land cover relationships and correcting for other regions. Other ALCC models work slightly differently, but they also tend towards global application of rules derived from understanding of European land use and settlement. So that's Western Europe. Here's another comparison of ALCC models on a global scale with Hyde. I circled it because that's the one most often used in testing climate models, is the Hyde model. So this is 2,000 years ago, and you can see that the Hyde model the world looks pretty dark green there. So 2,000 years ago, it looks like the grid cells mostly entirely under natural vegetation, which is a bit of a surprise sometimes to archaeologists and historians who've been working in those areas and thought something was going on there. Okay. So the Hyde model allocates population data around the map, assuming, for example, that agriculturalists will settle near rivers, an assumption based on European settlement patterns, but certainly not globally applicable. So hidden into the model assumptions then, and I'll just give you a few examples because it's fairly painful to go through it, the Eurocentric environmental narratives make their way into what seem to be dispassionate scientific assumptions. So echoing India's imagined primeval forests, some ALCC models presume, most of them honestly, presume a singular trajectory of change from forest to open grassland or cropland for every transition to farming. So this assumption is the assumption upon which carbon budget calculations are made. And it imagines forests have been a universal precursor to farming. So the temptation to take as unmarked categories both the label usually applied to early farming in Europe, the Neolithic. All farming is called Neolithic. I think you New World people won't like that. And the specific trajectory of change associated with early farming in temperate Europe appears to be very difficult for the modeling community to resist. And in fact, I changed the caption on this slide. This is one my good colleague gave it to me, but she had written fraction of grid cell under forest. But actually, that's not right, right? So the notion of natural vegetation in forest is very deeply ingrained, even in the work of people who really ought to know better. So one more article, Boyle et al., for example, presume that a singular trajectory of change from forest to open grassland or cropland sufficiently characterizes all Neolithic transitions. So this assumption, again, they built their carbon budget calculations from it, imagines forests to have been universal. Boyle and colleagues assume a carbon loss of 13.4 kilograms per square meter with the transition to farming. And in order to convert population data into area of cropland, they use Sue Gregg's calculation of the amount of land a hypothetical farming community in Neolithic Central Europe around 6,500 BCE would use to the globe. There's nothing wrong with Sue Gregg's estimations. They're not intrinsically problematic, but what is problematic is the way in which a specifically temperate zone sense of land use and land cover change, and within that, a specifically European sense of process, has dominated the creation of seemingly dispassionate and also global scientific assessments. So outside the small world of Europe, there are important land use differences. Where tropical forests give way to agroforestry regimes, for example, changes in carbon budgets would have been less significant than estimated by Boyle et al., because there's still a lot of trees, right? While transitions to flooded field farming, like rice paddies, would have had a much greater impact on carbon cycling and also on things like methane than the figures drawn from temperate forest to grassland transitions. So already it's clear that Alsisi models seriously underestimate the extent of pre-industrial rice farming. And similarly, the vast areas of raised and flooded fields of the Americas, remnants of highly intensive forms of farming, are almost certainly underestimated by modelers. I'd be willing to put money on it. Okay, so how much does this all matter then? It might matter a great deal. Western Europe, for all that it's impressively well studied, actually covers a very modest portion of the world, around 7%. So here we have climate zones covered by Western Europe. This is a silly classification called the mild climate. Put it this way. Okay, Western Europe, only about 7% of the Earth's surface. The vast areas of the tropics, arid and humid, are in global terms certainly more significant, a weighting which is not highly evident in scholarly attention or certainly in funding. As Malm and Hornberg have argued, Anthropocene narratives that depict human beings as a species, quote, ascending to power over the rest of the Earth system, end quote, falsely naturalize intraspecies inequality, noting that the creation of a fossil fuel economy is more a product of particular social relations than of essential human biology. This is certainly also true for farming as a practice. Right? Not only is agriculture much older than 6,000 years in many regions outside of Western Europe, but it was and still is incredibly diverse. And this deep and complex legacy of anthropogenic environmental change, as yet, I would say, is poorly synthesized and quantified, really needs to be considered before we can conclude that the last couple of centuries and the future are times of existential difference in human engagement with the Earth. This is not an argument about CO2 levels or about chronology, but about how we understand human land use and its effects. So drawing a line at 1750, 1850, or 1945, these are the arguments in the Anthropocene discourse, runs the risk of assuming that older human-environment interactions were qualitatively different, marked by different kinds of agents and different kinds of processes, and we already know this not to be true. So the search for Anthropocene beginnings then falls within the larger project of seeking historical baselines, which separate the human from the non-human, quests for a time and place of human-free nature. Such a goal mirrors cultural histories which posit fundamental human transformations at moments of ontological change, whether it's civilization, colonialism, modernity, whatever. postulating the existence of an era prior to some kind of ecological fall from grace. But there's no such baseline, right? No Edenic state to be found. Humans have been part of the Earth system for much longer than the Holocene and have long been active agents of change. There's little compelling evidence for viewing prehistoric, pre-industrial, or pre-nuclear humans as somehow agentively different from us. Nobody disputes, or nobody who has any brains, disputes the fact that recent biogeophysical transformations are large, significant, and quite dangerous. The current crisis is indeed, I think, what makes understanding the empirical record of actual historical land use and land cover change all that more imperative. So while there are empirical grounds for objecting to the creation of a new geological era, and much more importantly, I think, for the idea of a new kind of relationship between humans and the Earth system, there's also, to me, something disconcerting in a presumably global science so powerfully built out from European chronologies, histories, ecologies, and modes of land use. Potential natural vegetation in these models easily gets reimagined as forests, and calculations of carbon loss are made as if forests were the default natural state, despite the fact that in many regions, early farming, say, emerged in non-forested landscapes, just for example. So from entrenched nature culture dualities to quests for human-free or modernity-free baselines, to specific strategies of modeling change, really say the cultural blinders that we wear and the stories that we tell may impede our understanding of the complex and diverse history of the Earth system. And this history is a history of which we have been, and I hope we hope to continue to be a part of, is really just too important to limit in this way. Thank you. That's the really big question, right? So I mean, it's easy to point out the limits of current estimations. It's more difficult to make different estimations. Right? So we're actually working on a paper right now about that very thing. With the first set of revised land use estimations that we put together, a bunch of us, for central, middle America at 1500. So it's a very rough first approximation of where farming is located at that time. We compared it to the high model, and we see really significant differences. So the next step then is to say, okay, then what's the number of that difference for calculations? Those calculations are always fraught, but I have a feeling the number is going to come out fairly different, right? So the grand idea, which is, say, insanely ambitious, is to put together information on land cover, so vegetation from pollen data, human land use, just in very simple kind of classificatory terms, for 3 or 4 time slices across the Holocene, and to make those kinds of calculations. But we haven't actually, I can't give you a number right now. Greg?
Wonderful talk, Kathy. Thank you very much. One possible read on what you're saying, and I wonder what you would think about this, is that you might be arguing for something like what Weber called a value-free version of what we do in anthropology and archaeology. And I say that, having been someone who in the 1980s and 1990s, worked on the Amazon problem, and the rainforest issue was a big selling point, deforestation. And Clark Erickson, of course, came along and told us that wasn't a very good model we were using there. I think those of us on the anthropology side didn't really think we were talking about real science in that regard. What we were trying to do is to protect indigenous populations. And so we were entering into a political foray in which the lungs of the earth sold very well. So I found myself doing exhibits in museums and giving talks and so forth on these issues. So I mean, one way to think about what you're saying is that when we do engage there, we're sort of contaminating what we do in the way of anthropology and archaeology with what's going on in the public arena. So just want to hear your thoughts.
So that's always in one form or another, that's always a question, right? And whenever I give a talk like this, there's always a question, particularly when I talk to to activists. Say. So when I gave a similar kind of talk to environmental activist group, and they said, but we need the idea of, we need ecological romanticism because it's very, it plays. Right? But I think that there are a couple of points, and part of the reason I mentioned Vasant Sabharwal's clever article in there is, first of all, there's a kind of question of credibility, right? First, I think that getting it right is important just by itself. I mean, no matter what. But if scholars, who have good motivation, they want to protect forests and indigenous people and so on, promulgate problematic perspectives, then no one's going to listen to us anymore anyway, because those other people are much more powerful, richer, and so that's not going to help. But what also happens, something like that, is when you depict, for example, groups of people as being intrinsically closer to nature or something, you separate them from other people in a kind of fundamental way and take away agency, right? Because I think that if instead of having people who are intrinsically close to nature, people who are clever and who have done things that have been sustainable and I don't like the word sustainable. Have done engaged with the earth in ways that have been productive, then that's something to learn from. Right? Something that they have done not by virtue of their being, but by virtue of their doing. Right? So I think if we look at the long historic record of humans on the earth, we see both, say, success and failure. We've done horrible, stupid things, and we've done some not so bad things, right? And that really, we're all the same basic kind of person all the way up and down, right? So, I think that it's more hopeful in a way also to recognize the longer engagement of humans with the Earth system as not punctuated by the existence of fundamentally different kinds of people. Obviously there's historical change and cultural variability, or we wouldn't be anthropologists and archaeologists, right? But I think that those of us on the historical side also always want to learn from the past. And if there's nothing to be learned from the past, because we've entered an entirely new state of being, then that's pretty discouraging indeed. So, there was a question yeah.
I was just thinking again, I was wondering whether you could just provide a little more information about when this issue of Islam and Muslim presence in India became part of this generation, nationalist generation narrative. Was it Christian era, before, after that? And what are the reasons given for this, if any? And you mentioned religious issues in archaeological flow and water management, so it's just
Yeah, that's a complicated and important question, right? So, and not necessarily related to the Anthropocene or anything, but the idea that in South Asian history there has been a kind of long-standing fundamental antagonism between Islam and the practitioners of Islam and the practitioners of other religions is one that scholars have debated, but it does seem to be, as in that kind of formulation of a concrete opposition, more a colonial construct than anything else, to be sure, right? But again, all of those kinds of and those kinds of oppositions were definitely encouraged in the politics of colonial census making and in the independence movement, right, in terms of notions of self-determination and so on. So that's how we get India, Pakistan, and so on. So the kinds of I'm not sure where I was going with this, but it is a very curious thing, right? So you see that in that particular story that I gave you, you have both the sort of notions of foreign invasions, which is the way in which Islam is often talked about in a kind of more reactionary, more right-wing kind of discourse in Indian history. And it's allied to the idea of British invasions, right, you see? But then again, you have the British develop scientific forestry, and they turn around and they start conserving, So I mean, that's another answer to Greg's question, actually, too. Is because there is a danger. I think there's a really potential danger in assuming that there are really people of fundamental, capacities or inclinations vis-a-vis the natural world. Right? So the idea that hunter-gatherers are one way and agriculturists are another way is not a completely stupid idea, obviously, because we're talking about patterns of land use, right? So one thing that in the Alsisi literature, came off on a tangent for a second, the reason the project got so big is because they wanted to the models go directly from population to land cover, vegetation. And the pollen analysts wanted to go just talk about land cover in terms of pollen records, right? But there was no sense that different patterns of human land use had different kinds of outcomes for vegetation. So now we have these three kinds of variables. But the idea that, say, Muslims and Hindus have fundamentally different relationships with the natural world is also particularly absurd, right? So I mean, that little story is easy to laugh at, but it's scary and sad too if you think that what it's being used for. Wait.
I'm curious about this sort of label of scientific forestry that you're using.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of sort of conservationalist models. If you look at the U.S. and the Department of Natural Resources, people are very much about sustainable land management practices, which seems actually integrated with people using the land. So I'm wondering if you're speaking about a specific historical chunk of a specific place like India, or if we're lumping this together in sort of a grand area.
In the context of South Asia, when you talk about scientific forestry, it's very much a historically specific kinds of things, right? It has to do with, schools of forestry that are, it's not just India, right? It's throughout the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And there are cross-fertilizations with forestry and other parts of the world. But that's very much a particular kind of program, right? And, part of the idea was to make forests sustainable for a particular but for whom? I mean, that's why I like the word sustainable. It's sustainable for whom and at what cost, right? But it was scientific forestry in the Indian context, I mean, to grossly simplify it, was really about revenue generation. Right? So there were tremendous difficulties emerged because, people who were doing agriculture, for example, are not always interested in the same tree species that foresters were interested in and saw them as, horrible, destructive people. But if you want to take the point of view of the farmer, then those trees are not of any particular kind of value.
Thank you so much for your talk. I find it really useful that you articulated and specified some of the dangers of the Anthropocene as a concept. But I was thinking also along the lines of what Professor Urban was saying, in the sense of what would be the next steps to provincialize the Anthropocene? And you, in your talk, you made a distinction between real history and assumed progression. And insofar as even real historians don't escape assumed progressions, how do we? Are we looking at a need for more data sets or more? I'm just wondering what.
Yeah, it's like trying to talk against nature-culture dichotomy while using words, right? Because it just is not going to work. So the idea of presumed progression versus real. So the point I tried to make too by things like the critiques of the scientific papers, I'm sure that Duckall and colleagues did a perfectly nice job of measuring trees and everything. All that part is totally fine, right? But they have a kind of an idea about change that structures their conclusions. And that actually makes a difference to the science as well, right? But I think there's a difference. So accepting the fact that there's no kind of, unmediated access to the empirical world, the real historical change is a shorthand and, simple-minded way of, expressing that kind of problem. That said, just assuming that you know what the past was is a little different than grappling with the ambiguities of multiple data sets, right? So I'd say let's grapple with the ambiguities of multiple data sets and instead of just assuming, and this is basically the case, that there were always big forests, right? And this is the argument that I had, for example, with my good friend and colleague Mahesh Rangarajan, who's an environmental historian of India, and he's the one I was, poking at a little bit about 17th and 18th century Gangetic forests. Because he told me there were definitely heavily, dense forests on the Gangetic Plain. How do you know that? Well, somebody said there were. Like, well, so it's just hadn't looked into it. I mean, we just forget. You have to start with some kinds of sets of assumptions, and if you're not constantly saying, really, how do we know that? Is that actually true? And so that's the distinction I'm making. I'm not trying to make a deep philosophical point about knowledge of the past.
So to just tap into this question a little bit, I'm curious from the perspective of an archaeologist working on this material and talking about these sorts of narratives, how you go about in your writing trying to avoid that archaeological science being the savior and bringing all of these things together. Because I think you did a very good job of describing this narrative in which Western science comes back in and fixes it all, which is clearly something that you presented as to be avoided in certain circumstances. And yet one thing that stands out about your work is how inherently scientific and strong the science is. So I'm just curious, sort of from a methodological standpoint, how you go about talking about that in your work without then painting that same narrative that you're critiquing.
I think maybe, I was trained many years ago in my very first archaeological training at the University of New Mexico by this blue-bearded guy. And, one thing that he said that I think is, useful is in thinking about the problem, of theory latedness, right? That there is no, there is no observation, there are no data which are not incredibly imbued and already enmeshed in theoretical relationships. I don't know if there's much more nicer way of putting it, and there's a whole philosophical literature about it, as you know. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn anything, right? And one of the ways of doing that is to, and just see characteristic of what I try to do in my own work, is to play multiple lines of evidence off against one another. None of them are necessarily the truth or something, but they're all, you might say, theory laden potentially in different kinds of ways, right? In ways that are not necessarily building one off of the other, right? So the kinds of assumptions, for example, that Tad has to make in the DNA lab about interpreting his data are different kinds of assumptions that someone has to make in the ceramics lab about interpreting their data. Now, maybe that's a far-fetched comparison because I was thinking pausing people somehow, I guess. But, so that we always sort of play our ignorance off against our ignorance and hopefully come to a slightly different position of ignorance as we go. Or have fun while we're doing it. I don't know. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer. Yes?
Thank you so much for your engaging talk. So how do you use all of your work and knowledge in order to kind of draw the distinction or create boundaries between interaction and manipulation of the environment with destruction of the environment? And then how do you channel your work into a force of hope for kind of uncertainty at a macro level?
Well, that's a good question. So, again, the idea of destruction is a really specific question. I mean, it's a culturally and historically specific issue, right? So there's a very important book in the development of political ecology by Blakey and Brookfield called Land, help me out, Clark here, No, it's the Land Degradation in Society, thank you. And they made the point that degradation is really degradation for what purpose, to whom, right? So a farm where in the Midwest, where drainage tiles have been put in, and produces a lovely crop of, hybrid maize every year or something, is to some, in some sense, a degraded landscape, right? If you're thinking about biodiversity, if you're thinking about trees, or thinking about bugs or something like that, from the farmer's point of view, the land has been improved and not degraded, right? So degradation, like destruction, is not an absolute kind of quantity. And I knew I was running out of time because I saw Nico like tapping at the table. So I skipped some of the thing there a little confusingly, but I was thinking about in my own study area, we've seen, looking at like long-term vegetation records, when there was a big city there, people cut down all the trees, all kinds of erosion, lots of problems. And I would say that I would call that degradation or destruction because it was problematic for people as well, right? They broke their own irrigation systems. It's bad, right? But the trees, grew back after the city was abandoned. But now that people are blowing up the top of the Sondor Hills, I don't really think that that's going to happen again. I don't think that pattern of deforestation is likely to be reversed anytime soon. So it's all about values in the end, right? It's all about a value judgment. If we don't have a kind of ontological priority for nature or something like that, then we have to make decisions about what we value, right? We have to think about what kind of a world we want to live in. So there's no kind of clear certainty in a perspective like that, which makes it a little scary, right? But if human beings have always been part of the Earth system, or almost for a really long time anyway, it's not like we can just remove ourselves from it. We have to make decisions about what kind of a world we want to live in. I think that's both scary, but it's also, to me anyway, potentially liberating, right? And particularly for youth such as yourself, right? That you need to, okay, let's do it. Think about what kind of world you want to live in. It's not that it's impossible now because people in the past used to be more in tune with nature and they knew what they were doing, but we're modern and alienated and we can't do it. If we're all the same people and we have record of both, success and failure in the past, then obviously success, however we define it, is possible in the future too, right? So it's up to all of us.
Thank you very much.